Hi, I'm Dave Epstein. Welcome to this edition of Growing Wisdom, where today we're going to talk about getting some plants that grow well on sloped areas. And sloped areas can be particularly difficult, and Dan Jaffe here at New England Wildflower Society is going to help us to understand why.
Well, Dave, sloped areas provide an interesting situation. In the sun, they tend to be very, very dry because they're well drained due to the slope, and the sun can really bake that soil. In the shade, you can get that kind of interesting moist but well drained sort of situation where the shade above hand will keep the ground somewhat moist, but then the slope will also provide some drainage to the situation. One of those kind of hard to find moist, well drained soils that a lot of us really wish we could have more of.
So Dan, what sort of characteristics of plants for slopes do you look for?
What I really like about slope plants is plants that can really show off the ground well. I like seeing a sort of horizontal structure as well as a vertical structure. Something, for example, like the Canada wild ginger that we're looking at here has a nice flat leaf on top, so that when you look at a patch of it, you really see the slope of the land. You can kind of see when there might be a rock underneath and you get that kind of hump in the soil. It really shows off slopes well. I also like finding things on slopes that show something off that you might not see in a flat area. Something like a low leaf to it, maybe a flower that appears underneath the leaves, a dark stem. Something like the adiantum here, the maidenhair ferns, have a dark black stipe to them, which you don't notice as much when it's on a flat ground, but you really see well when you're on a slope and you're looking up at it.
So one of the things I think about with slopes is erosion. So the soil washes away in a heavy rainstorm. Are these plants particularly good for kind of keeping the soil in place?
Well, some of them definitely are, and some of them maybe just look nice on a slope. The Canada wild ginger that we're talking about here is a very good choice for kind of keeping things in check. Once it's established, it's very drought tolerant and it'll really kind of hold soils together well. Another plant such as Gaylussacia brachycera, the box huckleberry, is one that really forms a nice thick patch, has a good strong root system, will really help to hold your soils in place.
So Dan, one of the things I notice is you have a nice mix of texture and height here, and I'm sure that's not by accident. When folks go out, they don't want to just get this particular plant or that particular plant, right? You do want to mix those, and talk to us a little bit about why that is the case.
Right, variety is really a wonderful thing that we can do in the garden, and certain plants work well in larger numbers than others. Things like the Asarum here, being kind of low to the ground and forming a thick patch works well in kind of chunks and patches, where things like the maidenhair ferns that we've been talking about here can really stand well alone. They've got such a unique texture to them that you can have this kind of patch of low-growing Asarum and then have them kind of coming up through it, and you could really play with your textures that way and get some variation into your garden.
Yeah, you can actually see how the fern comes out, and you almost have a ground cover under the fern of the Asarum.
Exactly. Having the two together means you can kind of get the best of both worlds, where you get that low grow that really covers the ground and gives you that thick, lush feeling, but then at the same time you get that full experience of the fern coming up through it, and it looks almost like you're in the middle of a tropical jungle.
So talk to me about how these spread. This to me looks like it spreads more underneath and sort of creates more of a mat, whereas the fern seems to be more clumpy that just gets bigger.
Exactly. This is a rhizomatic spreader, so it's going to form a rhizome underneath, a swollen root that's going to then kind of send off offshoots and spread horizontally. And that's why you get this sort of mat-like effect to it. The ferns tend to form clumps, and even though the clump will get a little bit larger, at one point that clump's going to be big enough, and the way it's going to spread is by sending out spores and forming new clumps in different areas. So working the two together, again, gives you that varied textures that really work so nicely.
And can you eventually, when the clump gets big enough, can you dig this up in the fall and cut it in half and create two clumps?
You definitely can, as well as the ginger. Both of these can be dug up in that way. The maidenhair ferns you want to be a little more delicate about, but it's not saying that gardeners at home can't do it themselves. Just kind of wait till it gets a little bit thicker. Something like the Asarum, you really don't have to be all that delicate with. Once you've got a patch going, just kind of get in there and start pulling it apart and replanting it, and you've got new plants starting in new areas.
Yeah, this is a beautiful plant. Anything with fall color, or does it just sort of disappear?
It's got a little bit of a fall color, but nothing all that exciting. There's other ones I'd go for first.
So Dan, you mentioned that this particular plant, the ginger, doesn't have great fall color, but do you recommend any plants that kind of have that 4 seasons of interest?
Yes, one that comes right to mind, especially for use on a slope, is Gaylussacia brachycera. It's the box huckleberry. And this plant has a nice kind of white to pink tip flower in the springtime. It's got a berry in the summer that is edible, quite tasty. In the fall, it turns somewhere between a crimson red and kind of a burgundy maroon red, and it's an evergreen plant as well. So it really covers all 4 seasons very nicely. It's one that will form a pretty thick patch similar to the Asarum, and because of this shiny evergreen leaf, it really kind of glows on a slope very nicely.
I like it. That sounds great. Thanks, Dan.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Dan, thanks a lot. Terrific information for those more difficult areas like this beautiful slope. You've done a great job with this, and we hope you've enjoyed this edition of Growing Wisdom. Here at Garden in the Woods, I'm Dave Epstein.